Hello, photographers. Shutter speed, like ISO and aperture, can be confusing, so I want to show you the easiest way to figure out what shutter speed to use when shooting in manual mode. Like ISO and aperture, shutter speed helps control how much light you capture for your photo. But in terms of how the photo looks, the only thing shutter speed does is control how motion appears in the image. Generally speaking, we want to take photos that are nice and sharp, so all that really matters is that the shutter speed is fast enough to give us a sharp photo. With that in mind, the quickest and easiest way to set your shutter speed is just to look at your lens. Specifically, you want to look at the focal length that you have your lens zoomed to. Now, why is this? It's because of something called the focal length rule. The focal length rule tells us that if the shutter speed is set to 1 over the focal length of the lens, then your photo will be sharp and free of motion blur from camera shake. For example, I've got my 40 to 150 millimeter lens mounted on my camera here, and the lens is currently zoomed to 150 millimeters. So if I want to take a photo and make sure that the photo will be sharp and not have any camera shake motion in it, then I'll set my shutter speed to 1/150th of a second. Now this takes all the guesswork out of figuring out what shutter speed to use, which is great. But when you do this, you will notice that all your focal lengths will not show up as available shutter speeds. For instance, there is no shutter speed of 1/150th of a second. When that happens, all you need to do is pick the closest shutter speed to the focal length of your lens. So in the case of this lens at 150 millimeters, I would choose 1/160th of a second. This makes it super simple to choose the right shutter speed for getting a sharp photo. But there is one thing to remember, which is that regardless of your focal length, shutter speeds longer than 1/50th of a second will start to show motion blur. This means that for any focal lengths under 50 millimeters, you do not use the focal length rule. Instead, you just set your shutter speed to 1/50th of a second. For example, here I have my 12 to 40 millimeter lens, which is zoomed to about 20 millimeters. With the focal length rule, I'd set my shutter speed to 1/20th of a second. But because the focal length is less than 50 millimeters, I won't be doing that, and instead I'll just set my shutter speed to 1/50th of a second. So setting your shutter speed works like this. Look at your lens. If you're zoomed to anything less than 50 millimeters, set the shutter speed to 1/50th of a second. If you're zoomed to anything more than 50 millimeters, set the shutter speed to 1 over the focal length of the lens. And then once you've set your shutter speed, there are two things that you have to do before you start shooting. First, you have to check your exposure indicator. I always set my shutter speed last, and when you have your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed sets where you want them, you then have to check your exposure indicator to make any final exposure adjustments. So after setting your shutter speed, if the exposure indicator is off, all you have to do is adjust your ISO to get you back to a 0 exposure. If the exposure indicator is showing in the negative, just increase your ISO, and if it's in the positive, just decrease your ISO. You adjust your ISO and not your shutter speed because you want to keep your shutter speed where it is to make sure your photo is sharp. Once you've balanced your exposure, you have to account for subject motion. If your subject isn't moving, you can get right to shooting and not worry about it. But if your subject is moving, then you may have to further adjust your shutter speed because the focal length rule only accounts for camera movement, not for subject movement. Unfortunately, there's no easy trick for dealing with subject motion because the speed of the subject determines the shutter speed that you need to use. But what I do have for you is a free printable cheat sheet that you can download at this link right here that gives you shutter speed guidelines for different moving subjects. In addition to helping you pick the right shutter speed for moving subjects, the cheat sheet also recaps this whole process of choosing the right shutter speed so that you have it on hand for easy reference. Now, if you have any questions about shutter speed or photography in general, let me know down in the comments, and then do me a favor, would you like this video and subscribe to my channel? If you really like this video, please share it with your friends. Sharing really helps spread the word, and I appreciate the shares. But whether or not you do, you better get out there and take some damn photos. I will see you tomorrow for the live show. Specifically, you want to look at the focal length you have your lens zoomed to, and I forgot to get my cameras, which I was going to use for props, in this video. Thank you for watching. Now, I get loads of questions and they all boil down to one thing, which is how do I make my camera do what I want it to do? And here's the thing, your camera is like an instrument, and you can't make music if you can't play your instrument. If you want to learn how to play your camera like the instrument it is, visit this link right here to check out my Guide to Shooting in Manual Mode video course.